It was one of the most unexpected, yet exhilarating days of my life. The afternoon was warm and tranquil, and I had just settled into my favorite spot on the porch, a glass of iced tea in hand, when I first noticed Ethan, my neighbor of 3 years. He was crouched beside his garden, a pair of gloves in one hand and a spade in the other. His posture seemed tense, his broad shoulders hunched, as if the act of gardening had become a burden rather than the usual solace he found in it. Ethan and I weren't particularly close, but we shared the kind of neighborly relationship you'd expect in a quiet suburb. We exchanged waves, talked about the weather, and occasionally made small talk about the state of our lawns. He had once helped me fix a broken gutter, and in return, I had helped him move a stubborn piece of furniture into his garage. That was the extent of our interactions until that day. He stood up abruptly, brushing the dirt off his hands, and his gaze drifted toward my house. For a moment, he hesitated, his dark eyes narrowing slightly as if deciding whether or not to approach. Then, with a deep breath, he began making his way across the lawn, each step slow and deliberate. "Hey, Michael," he called out, his voice carrying easily over the late afternoon stillness. "Got a minute?" I set my glass down on the small table beside me, already sensing that this wasn't going to be another casual chat about the neighborhood. "Sure," I replied, gesturing to the empty chair next to me. "What's up?" Ethan climbed the steps and sat down heavily, his elbows resting on his knees, as he stared out at the street. Up close, he looked different, tired, almost vulnerable, in a way that didn't match the confident, easygoing demeanor he usually projected. "I need your help," he said finally, his voice low. He didn't look at me as he spoke, his focus fixed on a distant point beyond the neatly trimmed hedges. "And I wouldn't ask if I didn't really mean it." His words caught me off guard. Ethan didn't strike me as the kind of person who needed help from anyone, let alone me. He was one of those people who always seemed self-assured, the kind of guy who could figure things out on his own. "Of course," I said after a moment, leaning forward slightly. "What do you need?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated, but it's also personal, and I need someone I can trust." The weight of his words settled between us, heavy and unspoken. I could feel the tension radiating off him, the kind of tension that came from holding something inside for too long. Whatever this was, it wasn't easy for him to talk about. "You can trust me," I said, my voice steady. "Whatever it is, I'll do what I can to help." For the first time since he had sat down, Ethan turned to look at me. There was something in his eyes, an uncertainty, almost like he was searching for reassurance before he took the plunge. "Do you have time to talk now?" he asked. I nodded. "Take your time. I'm all ears." He nodded back, though his posture remained rigid. For a while, he didn't speak, his jaw working as though he was trying to find the right words. The silence stretched, but I didn't push him. Sometimes, people needed space to figure out what they wanted to say, and I was willing to wait. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the armrests, as he exhaled deeply. "Okay," he said almost to himself. "Let me just start from the beginning." Ethan began talking, his voice measured at first, like he was testing the waters. He spoke about his job, how it had been demanding lately, with long hours and the kind of stress that crept into his personal life. He talked about his sister Lila and her 2 kids, who had been struggling since her divorce last year. Then finally he got to the heart of it. "I've been trying to help her as much as I can," he said, his voice quieter now. "But it's hard. She doesn't want to accept help from me, at least not the way she probably needs to. And I'm worried about the boys. They're at an age where this kind of stuff really sticks with you, you know?" I nodded, understanding where he was coming from. "It's tough," I said. "Kids are resilient, but they still need stability." "That's exactly it," Ethan said, his tone growing more animated. "And I think they could use someone steady, someone who knows how to navigate tough situations." He paused, glancing at me as though gauging my reaction. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk to her," he said. "You've always struck me as someone good at understanding people, at listening without judgment. I think she could really use that right now." The request cut me off guard. I had expected something practical, like borrowing a tool or helping him with a project, not this. But as I thought about it, I realized how much it meant that Ethan would ask me for something so personal. The next day, I found myself standing outside a small coffee shop, scanning the crowd for Lila. Ethan had described her as petite, with dark hair and a kind smile. and it didn't take long for me to spot her. She was sitting at a corner table by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee as she stared out at the street. "Lila?" I asked as I approached, offering a tentative smile. She looked up, her expression guarded but polite. "You must be Michael," she said, standing to shake my hand. "Ethan told me a lot about you." "Hopefully all good things," I said lightly, taking a seat across from her. She smiled faintly, though her eyes remained cautious. "Mostly," she said. There was a brief, awkward silence as we both tried to figure out how to start. Finally, I decided to take the plunge. "Ethan mentioned you've been going through a tough time," I said gently. "I just want you to know I'm here to listen, no judgment." Lila's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she let out a small sigh. "I appreciate that," she said. It's been a lot. The divorce, trying to keep things stable for the boys, figuring out what comes next. Sometimes it feels like it's too much." I nodded, letting her words sink in before responding. "It sounds like you've been carrying a lot on your own," I said. "But you don't have to. It's okay to lean on people, even if it's just for a little while." Her eyes softened, and I could see the walls she had built around herself starting to come down. "Ethan means well," she said after a moment. "But sometimes he doesn't know how to help without making it feel like I'm failing." "I get that," I said. "He cares about you, but he doesn't always know the right way to show it. That's where I come in, I guess, to remind you that accepting help doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you're human." For the next hour, we talked. Lila opened up about her struggles, her fears, and her hopes for the future. She spoke about her boys, how they were adjusting, what they needed, and how hard it was to feel like she was enough for them. I listened, offering encouragement where I could, but mostly just letting her speak. By the time we finished, she looked lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "I didn't realize how much I needed this." "Any time," I said. "Really, you're not alone in this, Lila." She smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. "I'll try to remember that." As I left the coffee shop, I felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond words. Helping Lila had been more fulfilling than I had expected, and it made me realize just how much I valued the connections I was building with her and with Ethan. I was curious what Ethan's reaction would be to the fact that I had fulfilled his request. That evening, Ethan stopped by again, his expression of curiosity and hope. "How'd it go?" he asked as soon as I opened the door. "It went well," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "She's amazing, Ethan. Stronger than she gives herself credit for." Relief washed over his face, and he let out a deep breath. "I can't thank you enough," he said. "I knew she'd open up to you. She's lucky to have you." "So am I," I said. Ethan looked at me then, his gaze lingering in a way that made my chest tighten. There was something unspoken between us, something that had been building since the moment he knocked on my door that first afternoon. As the silence stretched, I realized I didn't want to ignore it any longer. Ethan lingered in the doorway, his expression caught somewhere between gratitude and hesitation. His presence filled the space with an unspoken tension that was hard to ignore. I stepped back, gesturing for him to come further inside, and he took a cautious step forward, his gaze never quite meeting mine. "You've done so much already," he began, his voice quieter now. "I don't want to take up more of your time." "You're not," I replied firmly. "You're welcome here any time, Ethan. You know that." He offered a faint smile, but his posture remained stiff, as though he was holding something back. I didn't expect this to go so well," he said. "Lila seemed lighter when I talked to her earlier, and I know that's because of you." "She's doing the hard work," I said, brushing off his praise. "I just gave her a space to breathe." Ethan nodded, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "Still, it means a lot to both of us." We stood there for a moment, the air between us heavy with something unspoken. Finally, I decided to break the silence. "Can I get you something to drink?" I asked, heading toward the kitchen. "Coffee, tea, maybe something stronger." "Water's fine," he said, following me into the kitchen. As I filled the glass, I felt his gaze on me, steady and intent. When I turned back to hand it to him, our fingers brushed, and the contact sent a small jolt through me. He held my gaze for a moment, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of us. "Ryan," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, leaning back against the counter. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "Why did you say yes to helping Lila? I mean, you didn't have to, but you did. Why?" The question caught me off guard, and I took a moment to gather my thoughts. "Because you asked," I said simply, "and because I could see how much it meant to you. Helping her felt like the right thing to do." Ethan studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You're a good man, Ryan," he said finally. "Better than I think you realize." I felt my cheeks warm under his gaze, and I looked away, focusing on the glass in his hand. "I just try to do what I can," I said, my voice softer now. "You do more than that," he said, stepping closer. "You make people feel seen, heard. That's rare." I looked up at him then, meeting his gaze head on. There was something in his eyes, a mixture of vulnerability and intensity, that made my chest tighten. I wasn't sure what to say, so I stayed silent, letting the moment stretch between us. Finally, Ethan broke the tension with a small laugh, stepping back and shaking his head. "Sorry," he said, his tone lighter now. "I didn't mean to get all serious on you." "It's okay," I said, smiling to ease his embarrassment. "Sometimes serious is good." He nodded, finishing his water and setting the glass down on the counter. "I should probably get going," he said, though his reluctance was clear. "Thanks again, Ryan, for everything." "Anytime," I said, walking him to the door. "You know where to find me." Ethan nodded with a smile. "Oh, yes, I know, and I will," he said. As he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. His words, his gaze, the way he had lingered, it all felt loaded with a meaning I couldn't quite name. And as I closed the door behind him, I realized I didn't want to ignore it any longer. Something crazy was going to happen. The next few days passed in a blur, but Ethan was never far from my thoughts. I found myself replaying our conversations, analyzing every glance, every word, searching for clues to what he might be feeling. It was maddening, but also exhilarating. A reminder that life still held surprises, even when you least expected them. It wasn't long before Ethan showed up again, this time in the early evening. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, as he stood on my porch, looking uncharacteristically unsure of himself. "Hey," I said, opening the door. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," he said quickly, though his tone lacked conviction. I needed to get out of the house. Mind if I join you for a bit?" "Not at all," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He followed me into the living room, and we settled onto the couch. The atmosphere between us was charged, but comfortable. For a while, we talked about nothing in particular, the weather, work, the latest neighborhood gossip, but there was an undercurrent to the conversation, a tension that neither of us seemed willing to address. Finally, Ethan leaned back, letting out a deep sigh. "You know," he said, his voice quieter now, "I've been thinking a lot about not having to do everything alone, and I think you're right. But it's hard. Letting someone in, letting them see the parts of you that aren't perfect." "Alan," I said gently, turning to face him, "you don't have to be perfect. No one does. Sometimes the best connections come from showing the messy, vulnerable parts of ourselves." He looked at me then, his expression open but hesitant. "That's easier said than done," he said softly. "I know," I said, "but I'm here if you're ready to try." The words hung between us, heavy with meaning, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. But then, slowly, he nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks, Ryan," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "That means more than you know." As the evening wore on, the tension between us began to ease, replaced by a quiet understanding that felt more profound than words could express. We didn't need to say anything else. The connection we shared spoke volumes on its own. And as I sat there, listening to Ethan's voice and watching the way his eyes lit up when he spoke, I realized that this was only the beginning of something far greater than either of us had imagined. The following days were filled with a newfound lightness, a sense of possibility that I hadn't felt in years. Ethan and I began spending even more time together, our conversations growing deeper as we explored the uncharted territory of this connection between us. It was as though the walls we had both built around ourselves were finally crumbling, leaving us free to truly see each other. One evening, as we sat on his porch, watching the sunset, Ethan turned to me with a contemplative look in his eyes. "You know," he began, his tone tinged with hesitation, "I've been thinking about what you said the other night." "Which part?" I asked, leaning closer. "About deserving happiness," he said, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I've always believed that happiness was something you earned by doing the right thing, by being responsible. But maybe it's not that complicated. Maybe it's just about letting yourself feel it when it comes." "That's exactly what it is," I said, my voice gentle. "Happiness doesn't have to be something you work for. It can just be." He looked at me then, his expression filled with a quiet determination. "You make me want to believe that," he said softly. "You make me want to let go of all the reasons I've told myself I couldn't have this." "You can," I said, reaching out to take his hand. "And you don't have to do it alone." The weight of my words seemed to settle over him, and he nodded, a small but significant shift in his posture. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "for believing in me." As our relationship deepened, so did the challenges we faced. Ethan's hesitation to fully embrace what we had was understandable, given his history of putting others before himself. But as we navigated those moments of doubt together, I found myself growing even more certain that what we shared was worth fighting for. One evening, as we prepared dinner in his kitchen, Ethan turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "There's something I want to ask you," he said, his tone tentative. "Anything," I replied, setting down the knife I had been using to chop vegetables. He hesitated for a moment before meeting my gaze. "Do you ever think about where this is going? About us?" "All the time," I said honestly. "And I think it's going somewhere incredible." A smile tugged at his lips, but there was still a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I want that too," he said. "But it scares me, Ryan. I've spent so long convincing myself that I didn't need anyone, that I could handle everything on my own. Letting you in, it's not easy." "I know," I said, stepping closer and placing a hand on his arm. "But you don't have to have it all figured out right now. We can take it one at a time." Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing under my touch. "You make it sound so simple," he said. "Maybe it is," I said with a small smile. "Sometimes we're the ones who make things more complicated than they need to be." His laughter was soft but genuine, and he nodded. "You might be right about that." As the night wore on, we found ourselves once again curled up on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light over the room. Ethan's arm was draped over my shoulders, and I leaned into him, my head resting against his chest. It was a simple moment, but it felt profound, a quiet reminder of how far we had come and how much further we could go together. "Thank you, Alan," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "For what?" I asked, tilting my head to look up at him. "For showing me that it's okay to want more," he said, his gaze steady. "And for being patient with me while I figure out how to let myself have it." "You don't have to thank me for that," I said, my voice soft. "I'm just glad I get to be here with you." His smile was small, but radiant, and he leaned down to press a gentle kiss to my forehead. "You're something else, Ryan," he said, his voice filled with affection. "So are you," I replied, my heart swelling with emotion. As the minutes turned into hours, we stayed there, wrapped in each other's warmth and the quiet comfort of knowing that we were exactly where we were meant to be. It was the kind of moment that didn't need words, the kind of moment that spoke for itself. And as I drifted off to sleep in his arms, I knew that this was just the beginning of something extraordinary, something that neither of us had expected but both of us had desperately needed.